Hey, my name's Matt, and I developed a game called Iron Reckoning. Released in 2020 on Steam for PC, Mac, and Linux. Today we're going to look at basically everything we can about this game. I'd like to share my thoughts and ideas and kind of take you back to that time period and discuss what made this game unique. So this will be a bit of a postmortem, and it's going to be a little bit rambly. This back to one of those kind of videos, I guess, but that's fine. Most importantly, it's good to archive my thoughts so that you can learn a bit more about my development process and that we can see how my development has evolved over the course of these 10 years, I guess. So before we get into the game itself, I'd like to show you this design document which I used to mock up the idea. So this is kind of like the first thing that happens before I even get into the engine or start making designs or anything like that. This is just me writing down what the goals are, what the pillars, I like to call them, are of the game. Coming up with a unique story, a unique design, and for this game, when I started development in 2018 or so, 2019 maybe, this was after I had cancelled the Bloodfire New Edo project. So there was a lot of pressure to kind of make something complete, because at that point I was a ways off from Burden of Proof already, and I wanted to have something tangible. I also wanted to break into a more action-focused genre. Much like the Bloodfire New Edo project, I wanted this to be combat-focused, to take a break from story writing and really hone in on just gameplay. So in that respect, I had this kind of rough timeline where I would just lay out, like, this is what I would do at each step, and I don't think I followed this at all after week 7. I might have tried to, like, cross out things that I didn't need to do, or maybe these are things I completed, but this was just, like, trying to get me on track for the first steps of this game. And it helped for making initial progress, but after a certain point, I just kind of had to juggle way too much. Yeah, Week Infinity, finish the game. That's development definitely took a lot more than 7 weeks, so it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. So the idea, you play as Jane Magic. I mocked up kind of like the initial mechanics of Bladerush, which we'll see soon, and I thought this would work well in sort of like a linear action game, and that's how I developed this document, I guess, coming up with these ideas that would drive what the game would be and what you would be doing for each of the levels and stuff like that. Here's some random potential names that I went through, a lot of them. Finally settled on one. Got some other names here for the main character, settled on Jaina. And we've got some backstory, which hasn't changed too much, but it is really interesting to see the early details, I guess, of development. I ported in a lot of stuff from Bloodfire New Edo, just to make sure that that work didn't go to waste. So here I just took screenshots and used this as a reference to let me know what kind of graphic settings I should make and stuff like that. Here's some layouts. Here's a concept art of the main character. It's not very good. I was still learning a lot about digital art and drawing at this time. My 3D skills were far beyond what I could do in 2D, so most importantly I wanted to just get the shapes down and the potential colors and stuff like that. From there, I really did most of the design work just directly in 3D, and I have a whole time-lapse creating this character if you're interested in that. And these are all a bunch of little other concept art details that I used as reference. So I actually have that model file open. Here we can see the 3D model. As you can tell, it's pretty neat. I think this is a massive improvement from both Bloodfire New Edo and from Burden of Proof, so to go from polygonal Conrad Cross to this, I think was already a huge jump. For one, just the amount of vertices that I use in this model, kind of insane compared to what I was doing before, and that just helped a lot to just get more detail in there. Again, it helped that I had a better computer, I had a new workflow, I had the PBR materials that I could work with and use that to my advantage to create all the metal bits and make them pop. I also think it's very important for characters to have some form of secondary motion, so that's why I included the cape and the skirt thing, the waist cape I guess it's called. This becomes cloth objects in the game, and that helps sell all of the actions that the character does. So when it's animated and walking around, let me see if I can activate the rig. Visibility, enable. So when the character is doing these animations where she runs around, it's going to cause the cloth to fly up, and it just looks a whole lot nicer. It's a trick that's used a lot in games like Assassin's Creed, where they'll have little clothing details that are just kind of hanging off the character, and they become simulated rather than hand animated. So you get a lot of motion and interest just for free. So that's kind of what this little piece of cloth is. It's supposed to come from this armband, but it's simulated. So when the character's animated, it'll fly up and look cool. Stuff like this little pouch here is just hand animated. I think it was another trick to get some more motion in here so I could move it around when she jumps. And of course the hair. It uses a planar method, as I like to call it. It's basically just hair cards stacked on top of each other, and all of that together gives the illusion of depth because you can kind of see through some of the cards. This isn't the most high quality thing that I've done, but it is one of the few instances that I've tried to use like a realistic style, and the planar hair really works out for that. I think maybe the biggest problem with the hair is just that the hair cards themselves, the texture is a little too opaque, so it ends up looking like a lot of block shapes. And most of the shape comes from just the actual individual card, like the polygons, rather than the texture itself, which might be a mistake, but that's what we got, and it defined the sort of warrior look that I was trying to go for. So yeah, I think this is a pretty impressive departure from my earlier works at this point, and seeing it in action was definitely cool. There's a lot of really neat pose design that I was able to do. For example, a signature pose that she would do is something like this, but having the arms be bent in and then more pushed backwards. So there's kind of like this element of she's ready for battle, right? Like she has her arms like far apart from her legs, ready to summon her sword at any moment. Another key pose might be the crouching pose, which is used in only cutscenes, I guess, but just the idea that she's sneaking up on something. It's kind of hard to mock it up in real time, but anyways, it's not quite like a superhero landing or anything like that, but it's just this kind of like momentum based, like if she lands from a jump she can go into this pose, or if she's like sneaking up on conversation with the Ward clan or whatever, then she's ready for battle. So that's kind of the attitude that I had to try and inject into this character. And here we go, you can see her in-game. I don't know if this is much of a classic pose, but it was just something interesting for her to do. Kind of like meditate and look out over the landscape of the game, which I guess is kind of the highlight feature of the world. Just like this island and the sort of machinery style buildings that appear over it. So yeah, I think I've rambled enough so we can get right into the game. Of course, a nice focus on the sky. I was trying to get sort of like nostalgic nature feeling happening in these first few scenes. This soundtrack is created specifically for this scene. I think this is the first time that I've fully created a soundtrack, like from start to finish. All songs are created by me. It ended up being over 2 hours, I think. So a lot of songs to pick from, but also somehow not enough, and had to reuse a few in certain elements, but I'm definitely happy with what I was able to do in that regard. So here we see the first signs of the Ward clan. Right off the bat, I wanted to introduce the idea that they were humans that you're fighting. And here we show some sympathy for them. It looks a little goofy, but he's sad that his friend has passed. And here we see who has committed the crime. This is all fight scenes that I hand animated. Looks kind of neat when you cut it up, but if you were to like look at the motion all together, I don't know if it flows so well.
They're human?
Yeah, so to create the animations for the mouth moving,
See this? I did this.
I didn't actually animate anything in Blender. I just created a script that
and I'm going to do the same for every last.
a script that basically moves the jawbone depending on the audio that it hears. And it's a pretty involved system, but it works in cutscenes and in regular gameplay. A note about these sparks, they actually cause the game to lag quite a bit, and I never found out why. It doesn't make sense, because they're just particles, but these particles were like destroying the cutscene at first. Let me pause. And the only way to fix that was to basically stop the particles and then create a second instance of particles so that they wouldn't accumulate and cause more lag. So apologies to anyone that has a poor computer. Those particles might still be a problem, but development tricks, you gotta just rush into whatever solution works. And this time the solution was just create more particles. Just create a different particle instance so that it's only on screen for a couple seconds at most. And that way they don't have to lag the game. So strategically changing them out when the camera changes was one of the things that I had to do, just to make that work. So here I try to show what your current objective is, just like go to the big glowing red thing in the distance. That seems fair enough as a start to the game. Hopefully by this point you've been kind of introduced to the concept and what you're doing here. Your goal is to kill these guys. And it's supposed to be questionable, you know, like, why are we doing this? Why are we here? That's something that we'll learn soon. But for now, I don't think players need much of a reason. They just kind of attack enemies that appear on screen, so might as well just jump into that. Okay, so this guy was initially a joke. I created him to kind of give the Ward warriors more personality, and this specific kind of character would appear in groups, where he would kind of like fly their banner and just like be alongside them so that they looked more intimidating, more complete. And to test out attacking, I think I just included him here, because this is where you would basically spawn in when I was testing the level. But one of my friends said that it would be nice if I just included him as basically a tutorial for attacking, because he doesn't fight back. And that's kind of the funny and sad part of this thing. No matter how many times you hit him, he's just going to be holding that banner. So this is a way for the player to practice out their moves and see what they're working with. Nice ragdoll effects there. And this too has physics. The colliders on your character's joints are still active as you walk around. They're just not driven by gravity or anything like that. So as the animation plays, her feet will actually interact with things that she walks through, which I thought was a neat touch. So here in the remains of the ward camp, we can walk forward to the red glowing thing. If you were to try and escape, the game would basically just push you out. Here's the boundary. So I think this is perhaps one of the more challenging things of this game, one of the things that didn't work out quite well. The fact that there's these giant open levels and you're not quite clear what you're doing. Like, yeah, if you mess around with the buttons, you hit tab, maybe at some point there will be an objective that gets added. You can read through some lore. You can read like, oh, she's been tasked with eliminating the machine threat from the aisles. And what does that mean specifically right now? Like, she's just standing in a forest. So overall, if I was to redo this game, I would want there to be just a better focus, maybe introduce objectives right away, maybe even carve the level in such a way that it's more straightforward at first. Although, to be fair, the game points you in this direction, there's a very clear path in this direction, there's a glowing thing. Most people did end up just walking this way. So it taught me about throwing daggers. This is hopefully something you try to do at this point. You can see that they build up on the bottom right. You might think like, oh, that's a cool attack that she does. But no, it's actually part of the movement mechanic. So I included this tutorial as a patch after the game was already out, because I was really frustrated with watching people play and just not learning like the literal main mechanic of the game. So at some point you have to just say like, no, I'm gonna force you to just learn this right now. It makes you throw a dagger and then hit the Bladerush button before you can walk anywhere. And that's quite unfortunate. I mean, I wouldn't want to have to do that. I don't want to force the player to just like hit buttons and be like, this is how you do it, you should play this way. But when you get to a certain point and you're just unable to progress because you haven't learned what buttons you're supposed to push at all, then something has to happen. Originally, it did say that you should press a button to Bladerush, and most people just missed it. They just didn't read it. They never tried it out, and instead they would navigate the game by doing basically the double jump move, where if you tap jump again while you're in the air, you get some more movement. And this lets you get pretty far into the game without even learning what Bladerush is. So if you haven't played the game, you might be wondering, what is Bladerush? You throw a dagger, hit the Bladerush button, and then you go towards the dagger. And you can chain these, so you can even throw it in the air. And then you get these crazy like airborne moves, which become more relevant later when you're fighting larger enemies. These first enemies are basically meant to just be another practice for, if you just keep spamming attack, you'll win. Because I haven't quite taught how to block yet. Alright, now the music kicks in. Reach a certain part of the level. Can make it to the save point. This is just like a little shrine that I built to kind of represent safety. And I wasn't quite sure how to do the health mechanic, and these shrines were basically a good way to just like refresh your health and also provide a save point. I didn't want people just pausing and saving because it would mean that you could just retry any fight that you come across. So allowing you to save only at these points offered more control. She just did a little animation where she bows down to it. It allowed me to set up checkpoints where you have to reach it to here, and then if you die during a certain section, you go back to the checkpoint. But I didn't want to like really force it, and with the large levels, it can be kind of tough to make sure that a player always hits a checkpoint if you place it down just based on entering a certain zone. So having it be like a manual action also allows people to do challenges where maybe they want to play through the whole game without saving. The problem there is just you want to make sure that everyone can find the save points, and that's why they have a big red glowing stream of energy, I guess. I don't really know what it's supposed to be, but this lets you know where the save points are. Hopefully you've learned that after you encounter that moment. So we've also learned how to climb up rocks and stuff using Bladerush, hopefully. Now we make it to more enemies. These guys have spears. So the enemy groups are actually driven... Sorry, the blocking animations are pretty cool. I always think that they're pretty cool. She detects whether she's blocking in front or behind her. And we'll make another animation to move the sword on her back. You can only block so long as you have stamina, so you have to balance it out with your sprinting. So as I was saying, the enemy groups are determined pretty much procedurally. There's a script that I have that spawns in characters when you reach a certain range, and the range is pretty big, and the number and type of enemies is just determined at random. Actually, it's determined by a pre-selected seed value that I just input for each enemy spawner that I put into the level. So I'll put down a spawner in a certain area and say it should generate between like 10 and 20 enemies, and I'll give it the enemy types that it can spawn, and then when you reach that point in game, it just spawns those enemies. It's a lot easier than manually placing down enemies one by one. However, it introduces a problem with saving, because if you were to save the game and you want to keep the enemies that are spawned, you have to basically reach into that spawner code and just kind of make sure that it still recognizes the enemies that it spawned and that it's not going to spawn more. So that was definitely challenging, just creating a save system that worked with enemies, and there's a whole lot of edge cases as well. Can't even tell you how many saving tests I've done where I like kill a certain amount of enemies, save, and then return to the same spot just to make it consistent. I don't even know if most players would recognize if enemies that they killed come back or don't come back after they return from a save, but I just tried to make sure that it flowed well, because I could. I didn't know exactly what kind of cases the player could get into, so it was better to stay on the safe side. These prop objects that I've been looking at, bit of low res, but I do like the way that most of the rocks turned out, and that's kind of how I was able to add detail into these areas out here. Just cover the hills with rocks and trees. Not the best way of making sure that it looks nice, but certainly better than just empty hills. And these are a lot of rocks, and I will note that they are all hand placed. In fact, the trees too. I mean, I paint in groups of trees, but there's no procedural algorithm that places down rocks or trees. Every single one of these is something that I've put down. And that was a mistake. that was something that I've learned not to do in the future, because man, were so many hours spent placing down prop objects, and it was just a huge waste. And I invested into basically a plugin for Unity that lets you just point and click to place rather than using the transform tools. That already saved a ton of time, but seeing how these rocks appear and the kind of patterns that they would put on the floor, I could have saved even more time by just writing a script that places rocks on hilly areas. And that's definitely something I'll keep in mind going forward, but here's a lot of pain visualized, a lot of rock pain. There are multiple different types of rocks with different textures, rotated randomly as well to give variance. I believe I even had to customize the placement script, like the point and click script, just to make it work a little better for my needs. And the trees, of course, ones that I created myself. I believe every asset in this game I made. I have a plugin for Blender that creates these trees. Basically gets the initial shape, and then I do some manual work on it to make it fit better in the game. Mostly decimating in order to reduce the poly count. And I also created a custom imposter script. That's where the trees turn into pictures of trees. You can kind of see this happening in the background, all the way in the distance. I don't know if it doesn't work with the field of view settings, but basically those distant trees all the way out there have just become images, and I did that by just plopping in the 3D model of the tree into a specific scene, and then running a script that takes a picture of the tree at all angles. And then when I have those pictures, I can just plug them into what Unity calls the speed tree pipeline. It's a level of detail setting where you can just place in imposter pictures. Some people also call them cards, or they're basically just flat 2D planes that have the texture of the tree on them. And at a distance, you can tell it's gonna save like a lot of resources, because loading in all of those trees as 3D models would be way too much. So that's all stuff that I had to do to keep the game optimized. The terrain itself is just default Unity terrain. I have a tool that can roughen up or smooth out shapes, and that's what I did to create the more interesting hills and stuff out here. And then for the main path, I just hand sculpted that and hand painted the textures in, as well as the paths. All of these little prop objects were also all hand painted in. This stuff I think is a little bit more necessary for this kind of game because it's linear. I wouldn't want to just like generate a terrain and then ask you to walk through it. I put in a lot of care into how each thing was placed, and I know it's not that detailed because especially when you get up to the edges, it's like, well, there's just nothing here. It's just an empty picture of some grass on the floor. And that's just a limitation of me being a solo developer and not being able to do too much. So it was either really detail just a tiny section of gameplay, or make a full 5-hour game that just has more level to play through, even if it's not always perfectly detailed. I don't know what's happening there. This game still has issues that I have not sorted out yet. I don't know if I've seen that before. This drone that's just firing at me backwards. Anyways, these are a type of enemy that I introduced to represent the machine side of things. It's not all the warriors. This is where you can utilize your alternate mode. You have like a laser fire similar to what they do, and you have a shield. But it of course uses magic as well. So when they get destroyed, it also leaves behind a destruction model. This is just something that I made based off of the actual drone model. And I put a rust texture over it, and I think it turned out pretty well. So when they die, they just spawn in this little destroyed drone thing, and it gives the impression that there is still something there, right? Like it, rather than them just exploding and disappearing, I think the idea that you leave behind destruction is a little bit more interesting. So for this, you really have to know how to blade rush or how to do the vertical jump to get past these hills. And here we have our first actual objective. So you can see it just puts down a marker on the map. I didn't have this for the longest time, but I got worried towards the end of development that people would just not know where to go or what to do. So I created this system that tracks missions, basically. There's only a few, but as you progress through the game, it just gives you a reminder of what you have to do out there. And again, it is unfortunate to just plop an icon on the screen and not let people explore for themselves, but it is a tough balance where they do need to know where to go, and although it might be obvious at times, you never really know when it's gonna matter that they have more info to go off of. So this electric field was really cool. This was also introduced a bit later into development. And I think it turned out pretty nice. It's quite obvious that there's something blocking you from going there, and obviously the tooltip tells you to go through that. But if you try to move through the field, it stuns you, and you fall down. It does look silly, but it follows with the combat mechanics pretty well. Alright, we're going to do some intense hacking now to turn off that energy field. Oh, it got hacked. There was a point where I wanted to do more effects there to make it look like she was moving around digital panels or something like that. Ultimately, I just didn't have time. Can she turn it back on? Yeah, okay. Interesting. I don't remember that. But in case you want to block your path off after you've progressed. And that's why there's consoles on both sides, because you never know when you might have to go back. I did take into account a lot of stuff that would be useful for potential speedrunners of this game. Namely the idea that maybe you can go around this, maybe you don't have to wait for the hack to happen. Workarounds like that are intentional. If you get high enough, I believe you can go over the energy field. It's probably not achievable in most areas, but if you're really smart about it, you could like climb up onto a hill and get over it that way. Maybe go around in some places. So although there's like an obvious block for casual players, I wanted there to be just like some openings that speedrunners could use and complete the game faster, just because I find that stuff interesting. And I do like to see when people take advantage of the mechanics within a game to sort of like master it in new ways. So creating those opportunities is definitely important for me. Another way that manifests is with a velocity mechanic that I introduced later on, where if you jump out of a roll, kind of like Sonic style, you gain a burst of speed. It's not totally noticeable unless you know what you're looking for. But this is another way that I thought maybe speedrunners could find this little trick and just gain more speed as they go through the level, rather than just doing the same action over and over again. It forces them to kind of press another button and use it to their advantage to get more velocity out of their motions. Much like the banner carriers, there's the picture drone, which doesn't fight or do anything, it just kind of watches you. These drones are told to spawn higher up, so you're forced to do more interesting things to defeat them. Either get up close, or use the projectiles is probably easier, but when they're always moving, it's kind of tough. Anyways, you don't have to fight them. It's another unfortunate element of this game that I didn't quite foresee. The idea that you don't have to fight the enemies, and I didn't want you to have to fight all of them, but when you can just walk past most of the obstacles in your way, it does kind of take the game out of the game. There's a few things that I tried to do to mitigate that. One is granting heal on landing the final strike. So if you make it all the way to this last move, and that lands, then it'll heal your health a little bit. As you can see, I've lost some. So you're kind of encouraged to eliminate some weak enemies if you need to get health back up. Another is just like forcing you into situations where you have to fight or else you're gonna be stuck. And this isn't really one of them, but if you get into an area where there's obstacles that you need to climb over, stuff like that, if you're not good at climbing them fast, it's safer to just take out the enemies that are chasing after you, rather than have to worry about them while going over obstacles. We'll find out the last method in a bit, but first I want to show you, I mean, this area is kind of like a flat plains. I wanted to introduce some like ruins and the idea that there were things around here before these machines came in, or maybe multiple generations of machines passed through this island and left behind their own scraps. The hint that there's like more history to this land is definitely pretty neat. I really enjoyed adding more elements of lore to it. Here we're going to see a classic Easter egg that you might be familiar with in my games. It's if you try to leave the level, Conrad Cross just kind of shows up and says, "Stop that." Okay. So that was that. I don't know if anyone has found that, because it's really out of the way and very specific in this one part of the level that you can actually go to. But I think it's about time that people saw it, because it's been 4 years. I think the anniversary of this game releasing was not too long ago, I think, so I just thought that was kind of funny. And of course that was done by just bringing in Conrad's model into this game, bringing in his animations and the texture and all that stuff. Of course, it's not a real visual novel system that's powering that little cutscene. It's just like a little script that plays back text in sequence. And as you can see, it was even kind of broken because I didn't account for frame rates higher than 60. So it doesn't quite play properly, but that's the idea. You can note the difference between like the sprint and the jog animation. She kind of like pumps out her arms further and she's hunched over more. There's more power behind it. This is all animation stuff that was pretty new to me. Again, coming from the burden of proof era of things and Conrad's awkward attorney walk. Injecting more like personality and realism into the animations was a huge part of this game. And you can see a lot of things at play here, like when she walks. Different animation. It's blended between that and the jogging animation. Depending on the hill surface, she might have to blend between different speeds and stuff like that. As she goes down the hill, you can kind of see like a bounce. And that actually comes from the IK system. This is something I talked about in my last video, where I will move basically the center point, the root of the character, up or down, depending on the difference of position in the feet. So when I detect that there's like a steep slope, I can move the foot down using an IK system, angle it to the slope, and then when I detect a difference between the two legs, well, I know that the foot needs to stretch down farther than what the rig can actually handle. So in that case, I just move the hips down, which bends the higher leg further and allows the other leg to reach the bottom. But that all happens dynamically. So as you return to level ground, the hips level out, and when that happens really quick, let me see, yeah, the slow motion key still works, so you can kind of see her like sinking down to meet the floor in certain areas. So it adds a lot. It makes slope traversal just much more interesting and realistic and dynamic, rather than just playing a walk animation over it. Obviously it took a lot of work to get that up and running, and this is kind of where I invented that novel technique of detecting the floor based on raycasts and turning off the IK to make sure that the animation was reset. But it was worth it, I think. Especially since I get to reuse that mechanic and concept in future titles. Here's dynamic music. I think this just happens when enemies are within a certain range of you. It'll fade in a more intense track that's synced to a less intense track. And I did that just by creating two tracks overlaid on top of each other. When I was writing the music, I just made more heavy instruments playing for the combat theme, and that's basically it. They flow together. So if you were to take away one layer and hear the ambient version, I guess, then it would be more calm. I only had a chance to do this a few times because creating multiple tracks for sections like this just hit the tree with that dagger. It takes more work, and it ended up being a little bit more efficient to just have like tracks play in sequence at times rather than always overlaid, just in order to cover all the sections of game. I tried to make sure that every area that you encounter has a distinct music track behind it. The music is really what defines a lot of the game, I think, honestly. Just like, you reach a new area, a new music track plays, and that helps it to just not feel like you're sitting in silence or mindlessly walking through stuff, but actually progressing the story, the narrative, and moving through the land. Okay, so here we get shielded towers. So this is my last-ditch attempt to stop you from walking through groups of enemies. Basically, your goal is to turn off this little thing here, which of course you can't do unless you wait some time to hack it, and that means you're going to need to take out the enemies. So this mechanic was added in like an afternoon or like a couple days. It's kind of challenging. It's almost like a final trial of this level here. And there's not much defense you can do against groups of enemies except to try and pick them off one by one. Now I can hack. Yeah, not only was this added in just a few days, but I did it, I think, within the last like 2 weeks before it released. So this was a very late change, and one that didn't like mess with the gameplay too much, but just made sure that you were taking your time at some points to get through the level, right? Like it helps pad out the level time so that you're not just rushing through it all. This is a procedural cutscene, so I didn't like animate anything for that. I just have a system that says I can place characters down, they'll have a direction that they move, there'll be certain camera angles that happen at certain times, and here's another one. The procedural cutscenes were a lot of work, actually, and they're distinct from the regular animated cutscenes that tell the story, mostly. And having those two systems in the game was definitely a challenge. So you were introduced to the villain of the story. His name is Nomad. And that distinct speaking pattern was kind of invented by the voice actor Thomas Cuba, who graciously lended his talent to bring the character to life, and I was really happy with how it turned out. And Jane is just angry. Whoa, no one's never caught a dagger before. Oh, it doesn't quite match up.
Correct. So you do speak human.
It is not your tongue that makes you human. We are human too. And we serve the Sovereign. You may call me Nomad.
It's a pretty neat character introduction.
What is this? Some sort of cult?
You are the one the Ascendancy sent to kill us.
They didn't send anybody. I chose my mission.
The Sovereign has foretold of your destruction.
Are you worshipping these machines?
That is
So there's a lot of depth
Then why are you getting in
to
my way?
kind of like the history of this place.
not what you
This is a cool shot.
child. They have allowed us to prosper.
And that's a classic Nomad pose there, just like waving his
All this
hand out.
what? Mindless slaves that do their every bidding?
How ironic that a puppet of the Ascendancy would call us slaves. You will go no further. My warriors will.
And in classic villain fashion, he walks away to let his minions do the hard work. Okay, so here we see a purpose for the electric fields, and that, again, we have to hack, but we have to defeat the enemies before we can make it through there. But you've already seen plenty of combat examples, so I will see if I remember this skip through button. Okay, I have a button that lets me just like warp through because I'm the developer and I'm allowed to do that, but you're not. This area happens to be the most detailed and most worked on section of the game because it was used in the trailers and kind of like represents the game as a whole. This is the central location of the world. It's basically a hub level you'll see different gates once you get into that section there, and each of those gates lead into a different level or different sequence of levels, and after you're done with that sequence of levels, you keep returning here to the giant tower. So that's kind of why the tower is so central to the game as a whole, but also to the world, like the visual design of everything. So I think it is tradition to include a windmill. So I don't have climbing mechanics, but I do have Bladerush, and almost like as a proof of concept, the daggers follow the the windmill's animation. I should note you don't get this for free. This takes some amount of work to make sure that everything happens correctly. Yeah, if you're not familiar, the windmill is used in, I guess, like some climbing systems. Again, Assassin's Creed has stuff like this, and they can really show off that, like, yeah, your movement mechanics, they work dynamically, like they work for an object that's in motion, and that can be like really tough to figure out, to handle. For here, it's more like the IK systems. They don't work perfectly, but you can see her leg bending to reflect the different angles of it. All that stuff is pretty cool. That looked like it hurt. Anyways, that's just a random windmill. They don't appear often, but it's definitely a pretty interesting detail. Lots of stuff out here. It's just like very meticulously placed. I mean, obviously, all of the fences. Every single one of these wooden fences was hand placed. The wood beams to add more detail to the ground. All these rocks were painted in, the grass, all the different types of grass. I had a lot of trouble creating interesting looking grass blades, because Unity's grass system by default can just be very blocky and ugly. I had to come up with a lot of different ways of doing this. A lot of it came down to texture work, making sure the brightness was correct. I think, yeah, custom meshes were used to create these patches of grass, then the meshes were added to the, I forget what it's called, the detail list in terrain, which makes it so that all of the meshes are added together for performance reasons, and they can be turned off as you get further away. However, they come with their own limitations in that you have to create them in like a really weird way with the axis sideways from what you're used to in Blender. All these different textures have to work together, the different types of grass. This frustrated me for a long time. Like, I've spent, I don't know, more than a month just focused mostly on grass and making the grass look correct, because that's most of what you're seeing out in the terrain. What I learned, though, I put forward into my future projects, and the end result is pretty impressive for the time. I mean, it works in shadow. When you're up close, I think it works pretty well. Like, you get these neat screenshots where it's just like a lot of grass blades. They don't look too out of place. And at a distance, like, you can kind of tell where they pop in, but it's not so bad compared to other games. I pulled a lot of tricks from Xenoblade Chronicles. That was one of the reference material that I had. Specifically, one of their tricks was to offset the distance at which different objects fade in and out. So the grass fades in at a certain distance, but the larger patches fade in at a different distance, and it kind of helps make the transition more seamless, because if everything faded out at the same distance, then it would be quite obvious what's happening as you get closer. But at ground level, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Alright, so let's make it to the tower here. This is just a city area. I pulled in some buildings that I had made for Bloodfire, but also created a bunch of other shapes. It's unfortunate how empty it is. Okay, so climbing the tower is a bit of a challenge, especially if you're not familiar with the Bladerush stuff, but I thought it was a pretty neat part of the game, because it takes the whole thing vertical. Uh-oh. Okay. So this whole time before you were traveling on flat land, maybe over some hills and stuff, but nothing like this. This is like a demonstration of like, yeah, you can get places with your ability. It's also meant to be like a opening moment of like, hey, look out at this whole world that's out here. There has been a lot of thought into like where I place stuff, even in the distance. There's an ocean in this direction. There's, yeah, specific pillars in that direction. That's an indicator of some stuff that you'll see in levels out in that way. And then this north path takes you to more foresty areas. The music slowly fades in as you climb too, which is just a neat little touch. I don't know why she has to climb the tower. I guess it's to interact with that terminal.
The machines have been building an army. A human army. But it won't stop me. I'll kill all of them if I have to.
Here we go, the big reveal of what this game is. The opening title card, late title card.
The Ascendancy wants to claim these lands. They want to eradicate the machines and make the world safe again. Well, they made a mistake sending me. I'm going to rip it to shreds.
This is where the Raw Productions Presents originated. I didn't have like a complicated opening title sequence in Burden of Proof, so this is the first time I tried out something like that. I had this cutscene here that I could like show off all the cool screenshots, and like this cinematography is pretty cool. It provided a great opportunity to show the credits and kind of give you some breathing room after all of that climbing and combat that you just did. Interesting. Yeah, there's just no sound for this part because I don't know. Oh, alright, no explanation needed, just get to the weapons facility. Okay, here we are in the next region. We've unlocked some new music. Environment's mostly the same for now, but it'll get more interesting. And I want to note that the layout of all of these different regions that you're traveling to does have a physical location on a map that I came up with. Oh, here, another dynamic object. It's rotating satellite tower. Starting to get lots of enemies now. Oh yeah, and they have laser cannons. So, it's kind of neat to dodge them. In order to have this many spawn in at once, I actually had to do some work to create a pooling system. Rather than instantiating each one It's a pretty common technique. You just have them already loaded in the background and you just enable or disable them when they're needed. So I think each laser cannon creates its own pool that it can draw from. Probably uses more memory than it has to, but it saves some performance. Some interesting visuals here. You can see I started creating these like bridge shapes. Anything I could do to just make it look better than just a flat terrain. So there's like breaks in the level up here. Sorry, I was just using the debug key to speed things up. Platforms that sit on the edge of cliffs, lined with enemies that want to take you out. And this might just be to test out the water texture. It looks to be moving really fast, but you only ever see it from a distance. So I think at like this scale, it just looked better when it was moving like that. Oh, I see where we are. It's just like a little port section. Oh yeah, and even though this is a different level, you can see the tower in the distance. So that's just another way to like kind of ground it and make it really seem like all the places are connected. And it is in the correct direction according to the way that you're traveling and all that sort of stuff. So move ahead the level, we can see there's some more sophisticated camps and stuff like that. So I just tried to make these little encounter areas that go through different stuff that you may have seen. And of course you need to get to the center of the camp to turn off to turn off the electric field, but I can just warp past it. Alright, so now we're in this kind of big empty field, and this is where I wanted to start introducing more stuff. The first new thing is these lasers. So they will target you and then lock in and then fire their really deadly laser things. They deal a lot of damage. It's easy to dodge, but you just have to be aware of it happening. I believe you can also attack them directly. They explode and they get replaced with the damaged version. This song that's playing right now is pretty iconic, I would say. It's it introduced a lot of like musical elements that I kept carrying forward. Really, oh, I got hit by that. It defined a lot of what makes this game stand out musically. Oh my gosh, okay. It's deadly out here. And so these things are just like little, I don't know, wave turrets, I think I called them. Here's some like bunkers. I put a little collectible in this one. So you can pick up these journals and then read through them. I forget how many there are. There might be like over 15, and they just tell this kind of side story about this professor. I won't say too much about this because I would like people to figure it out for themselves, but there's a lot more lore in here that you can collect. Finding all the journals is kind of tough. They are a bit hidden sometimes, but ones that are easier to collect are stuff that I wanted everyone to see. So major discoveries that you can make about the professor, I guess, are told throughout those journals, and it's just a pretty common way to tell a story without forcing people to sit through dialogues or stuff like that, which is important for these kind of games. I'm just skipping through some more areas. So these enemies utilize the same turret behavior, but they can do it while mobile, and they can also do it in different directions. So they're not too hard to defeat, but when combined with other enemies, they create more interesting scenarios, because now I have to dodge these different patterns while trying to take out other enemies. And this, I think, is really the highlight of combat in Iron Reckoning. The navigating the different things coming at you while also trying to deal damage. That's probably the most interesting that the game gets. Okay, so now we've made it to the first boss of the game. I purposely made this level quiet to start out because I wanted to kind of raise the tension as you get into the more intense element. This little area is just like a preamble, like a introduction to this kind of environment. I am really happy with how these stones turned out. They look like they've been carved, or kind of something more interesting has happened to them, like they've been placed in, or some specific wind pattern has like eroded them. You kind of see a hint of the boss over there. So of course it's disguised as a weapons facility, but it's not really a weapons facility. You've probably seen the screenshots of this one, I bet. Just hard cuts to this. Yeah, and this is a unique soundtrack for the boss introduction, obviously, and hand animated that cloth moving. Oh, it just goes through the wall. That's fine. Well, it should have been a bigger audio cue for that giant thing raising up. And of course it yells for I don't know what reason. And it had steam blow out of its mouth to make it look more human. So this is a pretty cool idea that I had. The idea that it like lifts up its leg to stomp down and there's like dirt falling from it. This whole scene was cooler in my head, but I think it still works out. That's a pretty cool slide. Again, no motion capture or anything like that. I just had to hand animate all this, and all the camera angles too. Alright, then you have to fight it. So, creating this boss was also a challenge. I don't know where those shots were going, but he had like different equipment and stuff, and the AI for it was just a nightmare to work with. Like, I didn't code it well, but basically it goes through a series of actions that it can take, and it'll try and determine what the best action is. So I think he's going to do the bullets. I don't know if he can aim those, or if he just kind of does it in front of him. Another really challenging thing was all the collision for this, because it's a rigged mesh. It's not static geometry. So I had to line up colliders on joints basically, and that took a lot of effort. Just like making sure that every single part of him was, well, it's not perfect, but mostly accurately depicted and rotates correctly. The way that I did that was just by exporting his different parts as separate meshes, and then using those as a collision mesh. These are his weak points. Alright, now he's doing the stomp. I might get caught in it. Oh no, okay. Oh yeah, that's really cool. The idea that when he completes his stomp, it adds camera shake. Sounds obvious, but again, you don't get that for free. You have to, like, line that up with the completion of his attack. There's other stuff you can do. I think he spawns enemies, maybe? Might be confusing it with a different boss. You just have to find all of the weak points on him and attack it. It's not too hard, but you do have a climbing challenge ahead of you. And the later bosses get more difficult as there are more things on the screen. Oh, he has some turrets. It would be nice to get some sort of like indication that they're being damaged. Oh yeah, he has multiple phases too, so you have to go through the other weak points first and then do the higher ones. I like that when it's done it just fades in. So obviously all these weak points are just like distinct entities themselves that I can just plop onto one of his joints, and then I can just create them wherever I need, so I could put a weak point on any place that makes sense. And it doesn't even have to be a certain number or anything, because all they do is just add a critical multiplier to the amount of damage that he takes. So I think you get the idea. Just admire his glowy parts and his tusk. It's meant to kind of look like an elephant, I guess. There's a lot of hit reactions and stuff that I had to do for the different types of attacks. So like she can get knocked down or partially stunned or thrown back. There's also a bug where if he stomps you in the correct place, his hitbox will just like actually push you through the floor and you would just fall through. And I never had a good solution for that because I wanted him to do the stomp, but I didn't want you to go through the floor. And part of what I had to do to get rid of that was to like add a hitbox that pushes you away from the stomp as it happens, so that there's like less chance that you get caught underneath it. You can still get caught underneath it. As a fallback, basically, I put another collision box underneath his foot, specifically for if you fall through the floor, so that you'll just bounce off of that and come right back up. And after I added that, I haven't seen the issue reappear, but I haven't really done anything to like actually fix it. So if you fall through the floor in this part, I'm sorry. The only other fallback I had was if you go too far below the floor, you'll pop up back into the air. And that's good enough for just making sure that you don't soft lock yourself, but it's obviously not ideal. Anyways, I believe I have a button that destroys him. Well, I just went through a lot of stuff and now I'm back. I will find the button. I swear one of these buttons... Oh. Okay, there we go. A debug button defeated it for me. This is a pretty cool animation, I thought. To just have different explosions go off at different times and then have them collapse. There wasn't much space for him to collapse more dramatically, but that is a little goofy. And then after it's been defeated, we're back here, and then here's the pattern of the game. You have to defeat another boss, and then we'll come back here, and so on. So, last thing I'll mention here, I guess, is just that the music cue that plays during these segments is the same boss theme. So the boss that you have just defeated, you get to hear that theme again, but in a kind of like somber, sad tone. So again, you might be surprised at just how much detail and thought has gone into a lot of these elements. But for now, I think that's a good place to stop, and I might come back to this and talk about the final parts of the game, because I think those are also interesting. But you've definitely heard me ramble long enough, so I hope this was fun. I hope you got to see some insight into this game. I know I've not talked about it too much, but it definitely was a fun project to work on. It took a lot. This is probably the first project that really like devastated me, just based on the amount of work that I had to put into it, and finding that I was not meeting the expectations and kind of running out of time. And it kind of only got worse for Shinogi Chess Club and beyond, but I pushed through it and I got the game out there, and that's kind of what's most important. And I'm not totally happy with a lot of stuff. I definitely see a lot of the faults nowadays. Obviously the visuals are not so great, the animations have issues, the gameplay is questionable at times, and the clarity of the objective is not always solid. Despite there being a little glowing red dot on the map, it still feels a little arbitrary. Tons of things that I would improve, but it's because I made this game that I was able to learn about all that. So in the end, I'm happy that I worked on it. I'm happy I took a step away from visual novel stuff. Happy I was able to get voice acting for the first time and implement it into cutscenes and gameplay and stuff like that. This kind of game was a long time coming, and I'm glad that I got to see it through. I hope to do more types of games like this, and maybe I'll talk more about that in part 2, but yeah, I don't think I'm done with this kind of genre. I definitely had a lot of fun creating the combat moves, and would be excited to try out stuff like that in the future. But for now, this is where Jaina's story will be put on hold, and I will catch you in the next one. And thanks for playing, by the way.